is owned by the U.S. Civil Service Retirement Fund. I'm sorry, that's another one. That's 6%. Let's see here. Social Security Trust owns 17.9%. I'm going to give you this news piece, and I want you to look at it. Look at how much debt is owned by U.S. institutions. Now, the Asians own quite a bit. The China owns 7.5%, and this is always played up. All other foreign nations own 11% together, and Japan owns slightly under China with 6.4%. If China and Japan teamed up, they could do something. But I want you to look at this and stop believing the propaganda. What they're telling you is China is the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt. That they are not the largest holders of U.S. debt. U.S. institutions could swallow the Chinese debt. Just look at it and get the fear out of your head. Because they always like to run the social engineering game of China's great, China's so wonderful, China's so powerful, and that's the game they play. They always play it. Right now, every Asian tiger, they played it. They call the Asian tigers, and the Asian tigers are built up, and then they're knocked the hell down. Yeah, they always do that. By the way, this goes back a long ways. This is one of their MOs. They will build any group they're building up. I do not have any envy for that group. Because the greatest group on the history of the planet to be built up by Team Pink Rabbit is the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the Northern Europeans out of the British Isles, were built up into demigods under colonialism. Benjamin Disraeli talked about they were the finest race in the world, and so on and so forth. And and they have tried to wipe them off the planet. That should tell you something. So I'm always leery about who our enemy's building up, because this is quite clearly our enemy. If they're building up China, look out. Look out. Part of them are doing it to make China acceptable as a partner for a New World Order in the eyes of Americans, to make China more esteemed in the eyes of America, and a lot of it has backfired because Americans are very leery about it. But part of it is done, is what they do before they knock the hell out of a group. And all you need to look is Anglo-Saxons, and you will get a great example of a group having the hell knocked out of them by the same people that built them up. They build you up so they can tear you down. Don't try to get into their minds. Getting in the mind of the Pink Rabbit is very difficult, but this is part of a social engineering apparatus, and it leaks out in the white nationalists. You know, on one end, they have legitimate claims about why are we giving all this stuff away, because they have to build them up. On the other end, they're worried to death about what type of deal elements of our government, like Team Jew Rabbit, has with the Chinese. On the other end, they're in somewhat of a consensus trance, as they're believing what the media wants them to believe about how China owns our debt and about what China's doing. There are elements of China selling Iran everything underneath the sun for this war. So obviously Team Jew Rabbit ain't running all of China. You know, one of the interesting things in Chinese histories was they had these big student protests. They had these huge student protests. The actual student protests are called the Tiananmen Square. And what happened at Tiananmen Square is something that most people never pointed out. You had this huge student protest that became a huge riot at Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is actually in Beijing. It's the center square in the center of Beijing, China, and it erupted into a huge fight between student protesters and the government. But one of the interesting stories that many of you have never heard is why this really got out of hand. It got out of hand because the local general in charge of putting something like this down refused to do so. Told the Communist Party that he wasn't doing it. Simply for one simple reason, this particular general and many generals at the time in China were allowed into business. This was in 1989. And they were allowed into business. And generals that are running businesses at the same time have no interest in putting down a bunch of students who may be buying T-shirts from them and stuff. In other words, businessmen generally don't like putting down student protesters or getting involved in conflict. You never let your generals, especially, get involved themselves in businesses. You own shares in businesses and whatnot. So the general refused to do that. Refused to put down the protest, and what type of power would a general have to tell the Communist Party to take a walk? This particular general had a great deal of power in certain business interests. And so they had to bring in a general from several hundred miles away to put the thing down. A group of generals, some Chinese, local Chinese troops said, we're not putting them down. They're not putting them down. They listened to their general and whatever. They brought in troops from somewhere else and general from somewhere else. And so after that, the Chinese the Chinese Communist Party said, we can't let these generals in business. But at the same time, they're making lots of money. In the late 90s, China was starting to get up and moving, really get up and moving. By the late 90s, it was really up and moving. But in 89, 90, they changed their attitude toward generals in business. Generals weren't allowed in business after this. To some extent, it's really difficult and is somewhat speculative to find out exactly what's going on internally with China. But what they did do was they gave the military more control over their own budget, and they placated them. They bought them out. They gave them more control over their budget. They separated the Chinese business from Chinese military, and they gave them a lot more. They gave the Chinese soldiers a lot better pay, and they've had a huge budgetary growth. The Chinese military has had a huge budget, and that budget that is somewhat huge now for a developing country has developed since that time, has gotten a lot bigger as a percentage of their GDP and everything else. But they allowed the military a lot more control, a lot more new toys. They allowed them a lot more freedom, military-wise. In other words, okay, General, you're allowed to do this military. In the military-industrial complex, you're allowed to control this and that. We don't want you in any traditional business because we don't want the type of interference. So there was a trade-off. They allowed them more power and more control over military elements. They allowed them more pay. They allowed them bigger budgets. And obviously, if you look at the budget now compared to 1990, there's a huge difference in Chinese military budgets. Just what we know about it. But the generals started exerting more control over the military-industrial complex, which at the time was it was there, but nothing like now. The Chinese military-industrial complex is a lot bigger now. And that was, of course, one of the trade-offs. Well, this trade-off separated the Chinese military from the business elite. They were all combined to some extent. Now they're not. So many of the Chinese military, they have their fingers in pies, whether it be in the military-industrial complex or otherwise, but there is questions about whether they can even control them, whether they ever had, whether they belong to totally different separate apparatuses and whatnot, coming into these wars, because they tend to be a lot more nationalistic and hardline than the business end. And they've become more so since being disconnected. Not that they're any less wealthy or powerful. They're very wealthy and powerful. They just weren't allowed in any type of traditional Chinese business, because the military-industrial complex is by and large overseen by the military. And they do have some attachés to the Communist Party, but those attachés are serious hardliners. So I don't know how this is really going to play out, but you don't want your generals in business, and you don't want your generals to have too much power. And a lot of people believe that someone in China has so much power that they could run out that test jet when the Secretary of Defense from America was there, just fooling around. It takes a lot of power, especially if the head of China doesn't know about it. And I believe that could be true. In other words, this event with this Chinese, which is not quite done yet, this Chinese stealth fighter, which wouldn't be truly stealth because all the seams weren't lined up and everything else. It was just a prototype. That elements of the military could roll that out to upstage the actual the ruling party of China. That something like that could happen in China based on events post Tiananmen Square and the type of power the military may very well have, that people say they have. But don't buy into all this Chinese stuff. It's pretty hard not to, because they're shoving it down your throat. But if they were going to have their New World Order, there was a time and a place that our race was in a lot more danger. A lot more danger. Not that they won't try to do something crazy. They will. Not that they won't roll out the dog and pony show. They will. They will roll out the dog and pony show. The actual New Age group that was really active in the late 80s, early 90s, things kind of died off for them through the 90s. They kept everything alive. They kept funding everything. But over the past 3 years, past 5 years, they've been becoming more and more active. Over the past 2 years, since actually I started talking to you, shortly thereafter, that fall, when I told you in these podcasts, it looked like our enemy had come to some conclusions. They have been extremely active since then. The Space Brothers this go around aren't going to land for some reason. They're not going to get involved. I have a reason why. That the Space Brothers then are not the Space Brothers now. And they're not really from space either. But this is part of their act, and we will see once it opens up. And who screws who on exactly how this gets written, I don't know. But everything centers on America. Yeah, everything centers on America, and that's what they're focusing on. So if you see the red hippo, you might see the red hippo. He may be real. He may be real. He may come out in America. But I expect big surprises after Act 1. But the reason they want to go to World War III is because then they can roll their informal global empire, which Americans don't approve of, into a formal global empire and take their big seat at the table, and everyone that has helped them gets a seat as well. And there are many ways they can go about that. I was asked about specific alien invasion scenarios. Well, and in some scenarios, world peace breaks out, and everyone's got to get together to fend off an alien invasion, a la Independence Day. They don't make movies for no reason. There are other ones that, benevolent beings land and try to help us. After a huge disastrous war. What is the last one they put out in the Hollywood? The Day the Earth Stood Still or something like that with Keanu Reeves was Alien Klaatu here to save us from our own environmental disasters. But it was really funny going back in time, reading about their ozone BS, because now you're talking about their global warming BS. It's the same groups. The same groups are running stuff, and they're getting ready to roll it out. They're getting ready to go for it. It's do or die for them for some reason. But that's a little answer to your question on one of the general overviews, besides White Rabbit Genocide. On their particular spiel. It always involves some type of global sharing scheme. It's just communism is all it is. It has always involved social justice and all this type of stuff, their version at least. And it always involves usually using high-tech technology that they've kept out of the public's eyes, out of the public's view. That is Team Pink Rabbit, and they are getting ready. They are loaded up. As Soros has told Glenn Beck, apparently Soros told Glenn Beck there, according to Glenn Beck, that you're either on board our New World Order or you're not. Well, we're not. But I'll be interested to see how they go for it. And it'll start with this war that's already started with Iran. I have no doubt that this war has started. Will the first start flying in Lebanon? Will there be a big... has the Chinese screwed over the Chinese? Are the Chinese getting ready to screw over Team Pink Rabbit? None of this is good for America, by the way. No, none of this is good for America. But we can pick up the pieces, hopefully. Hopefully. But that is a great little dog and pony show I'll roll out for you on an overview of why I believe they'll never get it. Because when I was most worried about them getting it, I looked back in time and saw all their groups drumming up at a period of time when they should have had it. I mean, in the 80s, you're just a young kid walking around, most of you listeners, and they should have had this done because my race doesn't even have its own media yet. We don't have the internet. We don't have anything going for us, really, except some newsletter writers. But these damn space brothers. These damn space brothers who always happen to speak English, Russian, with a German accent, and sometimes a handful of other languages. They always speak German, and they have colonies around the world, and they have wonderful technology they're helping us with. Oh, and I'm still reading this piece that he put out in 1990. The reason they don't let anyone else have the technology because it's too dangerous, and even the UN can't be allowed to manage it. I agree. We're in total agreement with the Space Brothers. But this should be a wild ride, kids. Get ready. Hold on to your boggins. Hold on to your big white rabbit ears. But I'll put up a piece, all the pieces that I talked about in the previous piece, 59, will be up. And I will put up an actual piece about China's military comes into its own. It was written by Stratfor. Stratfor is neocon central. It is Anglo-American central on what they want all their viewers to think of in terms of international global analysis. But one of the parts of the piece that you need to read is an Into the Chinese Miracle. Understand who's saying that. China doesn't necessarily hold as many cards as they want you to believe. And you can look at to whom the U.S. who you can look at the U.S. debt, which won't be completely accurate, but you can read this news piece and look at the chart. A picture's worth 1,000 words. And don't believe all the hype. But there's a lot of speculation going on, and I throw my hat in the ring because this is the biggest event we're going to see in a long, long time. And this question and answer period we're going to keep going with.